Stephen King absolutely loves animals, and I think you see that in the book Cujo. Cujo's a good dog. You get inside Cujo's brain, and Cujo wanted to be a good dog, and bad things happen. He's bitten by a rabid bat. So it's really a curse because there's no going back from that.
Perhaps the biggest, or one of the biggest challenges of making this movie was to make a St. Bernard scary. St. Bernards traipse around the Alps with little kegs of rum under their chins to save stranded hikers. They're friendly, named after a saint, Bernard. So the challenge was to make a St. Bernard scary. A lot of that challenge was met by the animal trainer, Carl Miller, who was three-quarters animal himself.
Carl said to me, there are no St. Bernards that are trained. And at first he says to me, why don't you use a different kind of dog? He said, you know, I have lots of Dobermans and things like that that are trained. I said, that's not going to happen, Carl. I mean, it's going to be a St. Bernard.
And I'm convinced that he was communicating with the dogs telepathically because he had an incredible talent to get the dogs to do what we needed them to do. He's the one that actually cast the dogs, and he cast 10 dogs in the movie.
We had, I think, 6 or 7 dogs.
My number is 7. That's the number I've always used, 7 dogs.
5. 5 dogs. Everybody says a different number, right?
Oh yeah, it was very amazing to me, the numbers of Cujos we had. It's interesting to me that the different St. Bernards were trained to do different things on command.
So in any one sequence, later in the film where the dog attacks the car, I might be intercutting 4 or 5 or 6 different dogs who are required to serve different functions during the course of the scene. And no dogs were hurt during the course of the filming. We had a man in a dog suit, we had a mechanical dog head, and we had as a backup a dog suit that we could put on a Labrador Retriever, which we never actually used. In some of the sequences, we'd use all our techniques together. There's a scene where the dog rams the car and dents the door in as the dog runs towards the car. I removed both doors, took out the front driver's seat, so the running dog could run at the car, jump into the car, and run out the other side. Then in the final editing, I cut the scene as the dog jumped into the car to a flash shot of the man in the dog suit throwing himself towards the side of the car, ramming the side of the car and seeing the metal crumple, and would cut inside to Dee Wallace screaming, then back outside to yet another dog.
But in truth, notwithstanding all of that, there was really one main dog, and that was Mo. And it was pretty incredible.
The one dog that was really the star dog and the most important to the movie was the one that had to terrorize the car, that would run to the car, run into the car, jump on the car, try to put his head through the window, open the door.
I think one of the things that makes the movie so spectacular is the tie-in shots between the actors and the dogs. And these very elaborate moving shots and setups in which you saw the dog and the actors in the same piece of film together.
It was a challenge with the dogs because they'd have to bring all of us on the set, and we would literally have to be emotionally ready. And then they'd bring the dogs because they would be putting this whipped egg white all over him, you know, for the foam. So the trainer had to work them as soon as they put it on because they'd lick it off and then we'd have to start all over again.
And so that makeup had to be applied immediately before every shot. And then hopefully we'd have an interlude with the dog not licking its jowls, trying to get the stuff off its face, in which we could get the dog to perform whatever action we needed it to perform.
I remember the smell of the dog food, but they also had put some sort of scent on this little fake rat that they would put in front of the dog's nose. And in fact, when he did get into the car, all he did was go and snatch the rat. He'd gotten what he wanted.
And you know, from here up, they look like they're gonna absolutely, you know, eat you to death. From here down, we had to tie their tails in all the long shots because their tails were going like this because they were going to get their toy, you know.
The dog's first attack might come in the fog when Billy Jacoby, playing Brett, goes out looking for Cujo and finds him in the fog in an eerie landscape. That landscape was actually there, but the day we were going to shoot that scene was one of the rare mornings when there was no fog, but we had a backup plan. We had rented what they call a naval fogger, a machine that was used during the Second World War to hide battleships at sea and puts out an enormous amount of steam. And the local fire department saw suddenly this huge column of smoke coming up from this hillside, which looked like a forest fire. So fortunately, it was towards the end of the scene that the fire trucks arrived, so we didn't lose a day of shooting. That was the scene where we originally planned to use the Labrador Retriever in a dog suit. And in the fog, I thought I could hide the fact that it looked phony, and instead it would lend the movements of the dog a eerie, abnormal flavor to it that would make it spookier.
Cujo?
It just looked silly, so we wound up not using it. And we were able to get what we needed with the dog menacing, then recognizing Brett and deciding not to attack him. It's probably the last moment in the film where the dog has any sense of who he is.
Cujo!
I had a very good collaborative relationship with Jan de Bont, and I wanted to keep the camera moving. For example, when Dee Wallace first drives into the barnyard in the Pinto with Danny and the car stalls, I wanted to get the audience to scream. So the shots in that scene were very carefully planned to achieve a certain effect. What I did is I led the audience to expect the dog to attack at a certain time from a certain direction, and nothing happens. Just for a second, long enough for the audience perhaps to relax. And then the dog attacks from the other side of the car, smashing into the glass, with accompanying sound effect and music and scream and everything, and it worked perfectly. Every time I went to the theater, the audience screamed and jumped out of their chairs at least 1.5 feet. Since Dee Wallace and Danny Patero were trapped inside this car, which is not very large, a large part of the challenge was to be able to film it in interesting, different ways so the shots didn't become repetitive, and to be able to get the camera into awkward, concise, tight situations.
And so I remember I said, Louis, I have to get a minimum of 5 to 6 of those cars, because I'm going to cut them up in pieces. And I want to make sure that each time the camera is inside this car, I want you to know how small this car is. That means the camera has to be in there, and to be able to do that, I have to cut up the car. So the camera is right there with the actors. But the good thing was that a lot of cars were for sale, you know, so we bought a lot of cheap used cars, and I had our special effects guy cut it in pieces. And I think that creates this incredible drama.
And then Jan de Bont bought another car, which he used to mount a camera on the roof with a periscopic lens pointing down into the middle of the car so that we could film that 360-degree shot.
And what I did is I cut a hole in the roof, and that was a photographic lens that I could stick through the roof, and I had built like a brace that I could rotate the camera myself. And I couldn't see through the fence, so I just tried to guess each time where they were. And I turn around, stopping him, stopping her, and then move around on the roof.
The thing I remember more than anything else was the spinning camera shot that was set on a pole in the center of the car, and it spun around and spun around and spun around to the point where it became dizzying. And it was an interesting piece of creative cinematography at the time, which I was really quite impressed with.
What I love about the movie most is that it's got some really dramatic stuff going on. And I think that's what makes the movie stand out a little bit, is that it's not just blood and gore. And if anything, there isn't that much blood and gore. It's all about the tension and the stress levels and the looks in Dee Wallace's eye when she sees that dog.
Please, God, get me out of here.
A lot of the success of this film comes from the extraordinary performances of Dee Wallace and Danny Patero. And Dee Wallace needed nothing to get her motivated.
She and I were together every day working on that movie, and she and my mother became really close too. Obviously, she sort of was feeding off my mother for that energy, and so the three of us sort of had this really great relationship. Just sitting in that car, waiting for the filming to start and waiting to get to that moment of intensity.
I have a minor in psychology, so I was really aware that kids that age, you know, they don't distinguish fantasy and reality.
It's not a monster, it's just a doggy.
And so before every scene I go, okay, Danny, you know this is pretend. You know the doggy's not really gonna hurt us. So you're not scared. And he went, yeah, I am. But it was really important to me to keep telling him that we were just pretending. And then after the scene was over, I go, okay, you know we were just pretending, right? You're okay?
Dad.
Because that wasn't really happening to us. And I hope in some way I helped keep him balanced through all of it, because I sure needed somebody to keep me balanced.
But there's that one moment where I'm just over and over again, I want my daddy, and she just loses it.
All right, I'll get your daddy!
It's how a mother would react in that moment, you know, and that's what makes her so believable. Every moment, she's just, bam, there's no question about it. You totally get it.
It's interesting because when we saw it in dailies, we all kind of went, whoa. And Dan said, oh, Dee, I don't think they'll like you if we use this. I don't think we can use this. And I said, you have to trust your audience, Dan, because any parent has been to the point where they lose it with their kid. And I'm not yelling at him. I'm yelling because I can't save him. And any parent is going to understand that. So God love him, he kept it in. And I have so many letters from mothers especially that say, oh my God, I've so been there. I know that moment.
If there's any story that people truly remember, it's when I was having the seizure in the car. And I remember my mom sort of talking to Lewis, the director, because when I was a baby in the hospital, I had stomach flap problems, and that caused me to have a seizure.
Dad, wake up!
So I talked to him, I said, so you remember what it's like? And he said, I think I know how to do this. I mean, the kid was just, he was like, you know, working with a 30-year-old in a 6-year-old body. And I didn't have to act. I was just along for the ride. He just made it effortless. I went home every night and said, thank you, God, that I got this kid.
I do have a physical memory of every time she put her fingers into my mouth, I'd actually bite her fingers. And that's why she's screaming ow at me, because I'm actually biting her. But it just brought it to another level.
Audiences see people being shot, stabbed, blown apart, maimed. They continue to eat their popcorn and say, oh, it's just a stuntman or it's just a special effects. But when it comes to human violence toward animals, they don't feel the same way. And I was aware of that and concerned about it. So that when I shot the scene where Dee Wallace gets out and actually has to fight with the dog and fend it off with a baseball bat,
Well, come on in!
I was very careful to never show her actually hitting the dog.
In the novel Cujo, in the final pages of the book, Tad Trenton, the boy who's besieged in the car with his mother, dies. And it's very dark, and it's very bleak, and that isn't what happens in the movie, obviously. Now, Steve King had the opportunity to write a screenplay adaptation of Cujo, which he did. It was not ultimately used, but in his adaptation, the boy lived. And the reason for that was that he said to me that this is the one book that if he ever went back and rewrote a book, this would be the one. That it had gone to this really dark place in the end. The boy had died, and he always had felt uncomfortable with that. He felt it was the right thing to do for this novel. But still, if he could go back and rewrite one book, that this would be it, and he would rewrite the ending so the boy lived. So in a way, he was able to have it both ways by attempting to adapt a screenplay that was ultimately followed, at least in the end game, in which the boy lived.
When Dan Blatt told me that Stephen King had been the one that recommended me for the job initially, I called Stephen King to thank him and talked a little bit. And he told me in that conversation that even though Tad had died in the book, that he didn't think that would be such a great idea for the movie, that it might be too depressing in the context of the movie, that you can get away with things in a book that you can't in a movie. And that clued me into the fact that he would be responsive to any changes we had to make in order to make the movie work, at the same time respecting the story. I enjoyed using the conventions of the horror film genre, and one of them is that no matter how dead the monster is, he's never really dead. He can always come back to life and still can come crashing through the window for a final scream.
My son, who was quite young at the time, said, "I'm never going to be scared by this," and I was watching him when that scene came up. And when that dog came through the window, he levitated about a foot off of his chair, and he said, "You got me on that one."
Sometimes the most difficult process of conceiving a story is to come up with the right ending. We toyed around with epilogues and scenes after the scene where Daniel Hugh Kelly arrives back on the farm and the family's reunited. But ultimately we decided just to end with a freeze frame at the point that they embrace. Because at that point, the point of the movie has been made, which is that if a real lethal fear comes into our life, it'll put a lot of our other less lethal imaginary fears into perspective.